Everybody loves
Sarthol.
May whoever did this die 1,000 deaths. May his stinking, maggot-covered corpse rot in the fiery depths of hell.
The Falmer are perhaps one of the most tragic figures in all of the Elder Scrolls. While they are little more than a primitive, aggressive and really creepy people in Skyrim, they were once proud Snow Elves, a now nearly extinct race. Having met a pair of Snow Elves in the Dawnguard DLC, it is sad to see how far this once great people have fallen, but there are those who say that the Snow Elves had it coming. So, did they deserve their fate? Or is this a case where the punishment far exceeds the crimes? Well, for that, we need to look into who the Snow Elves were, what led to their transformation into the Falmer, and the trigger point that led to their downfall. The Night of Tears. It is a lot of context, even for this channel, and there will be quite a few questions without real answers, but that's the Elder Scrolls lore for you, so lock in, because today we're looking into whether the Falmer deserved their fate.
We were once a wealthy and prosperous society that occupied a portion of Skyrim. Unfortunately, we were constantly at war with the Nords, who claimed the land as their ancestral home.
To understand the whole Falmer situation, we need to go back, and by that I mean way back. There's an argument that Skyrim originally belonged to the Falmer, but this isn't actually the case by the elves' own logic. Elves descended from the Aldmeri, who came from a continent called Aldmeris. Now there are some theories that Aldmeris is actually Tamriel since the land has been lost, but it is commonly believed, especially by the elves, that this is not the case, and after an unspecified crisis, the Aldmer went in search of new lands. This crisis meant that Aldmeris was now lost to them, and after a storm they were separated and landed in different areas across Tamriel, their new home, with the Bosmer landing in Valenwood, the Aelids in Cyrodiil, the Altmer in the Somerset Isles, the Snow Elves landing in Skyrim, and so on and so forth. Curiously, the Nords believed they were made by their patron goddess, Kine, whose imperial name is Kinnereth, at the throat of the world, and they went to Atmora after, then came back to Tamriel. So technically, the Nords could have been there first. Humanity is actually from Skyrim, and all elves are actually from Aldmeris based on each race's own logic. Now this might not actually be true, but it's the stories that they tell themselves. Still, what really matters is that Skyrim was home to the Snow Elves for a big chunk of the Merithic era, and the entire continent of Tamriel was so famously elfland that the Atmorans called the place Merith. It should be noted that humanity and Merkind have always had beef. It's literally built into them, it's not just generational, it's primordial. One of the first ever wars involved Auriel and Trinimac leading the Aldmer against Shor, aka Lorcan, Sun and humanity. While Shor and Sun both got murked, with Shor famously getting his heart ripped out, I think it's believed that humanity very technically won. The elves were pushed out of Atmora, so we'll call it a draw? Yeah, we'll call it a draw. Given that there were elves in Atmora, and they called it Altmora at the time, perhaps the Snow Elves were from this continent, but what I want you guys to understand is that humanity and elfkind are always fighting and will always fight. They are, from a primordial point of view, on either side of an eternal war, and if you want to know how far back this beef really goes, this Sithis video is for you. But the big problem for the Snow Elves is that they don't really have the best track record in wars. They probably would have if they slept better, and that brings us to the returning sponsor of today's video, Manta Sleep. Have you been going through your nights tossing and turning, then waking up without feeling well rested like your Dragonborn? Well, that's what Manta Sleep is here to solve with these sleep masks. With adjustable eye cups that alleviate pressure from your eyes, it will suddenly be darker than Blackreach, letting you slumber through the night and get up when you want to, not when the sun decides to beam through your window. I like using the cool cups personally, with my hay fever issues, the bloody Nirn root, keeping me cool like the Snow Elves. And if you want to get your hands on sleep masks to enhance your sleep, check out Mantis Sleep in the description below, and use code NOX at checkout to get 10% off. Thank you to Mantis Sleep for sponsoring the video, and let's get back to it. So we're going to switch POVs here for a moment to cover the Snow Elves' eventual enemies. The Atmorans found themselves in the middle of a civil war, likely with dragons and all, and in an effort to get away from all the fighting, the legendary Ysgramor led his family, including his 2 sons and a bunch of refugees south, across the Atmoran Strait. They ended up in Sarek Head, where the College of Winterhold now stands, and soon after their arrival began to construct the first ever Nord city in Skyrim, Sarthal. They then met with the native Snow Elves, and this is apparently where things go away from the usual narrative of elves hating humanity. You see, while the Aelids were knee-deep in enslaving the local humans, the Needs, it seemed the first encounters with the Atmorans and Snow Elves were relatively amicable. The Snow Elves allowed the city to be built by the Atmoran refugees, and while there were always going to be tensions, things seemed relatively chill for a bit. As Ysgramor's people began to thrive in the new land, more from Atmora joined, making Sarthal larger and larger, and from here there are reports that the Snow Elves grew more and more wary of their new neighbours. You see, humanity reproduces at a far faster rate than elves, thanks to their shorter lifespan, and when you pair this with rapid migration, the Atmoran population went from enough to fill a town to enough to fill a city. While most weren't warriors, these are still people who live among dragons regularly and are known for being warlike, so seeing this many arrive on your shores must have been a frightening experience for the Snow Elves. As for humanity, they likely would have sought to expand, given their rapidly growing population, and, as things seemed to be all dandy, everything changed when the Snow Elves attacked. Any Avatar fans here? No? Anyway, while the Snow Elves likely acted in the interests of their own survival, they had no way of knowing that the Night of Tears would be the event that would trigger their downfall.
I prefer Snow Elf. Those twisted creatures you call Falmer, I call the Betrayed.
We'll get into why the Night of Tears happened in the first place later, but we're still on the what instead of the why right now. The Snow Elves gathered in force and razed the city of Sarthal to the ground, slaughtering its people. There were only 3 survivors, Ysgramor and his sons, Ingal and Ilgar. I assume this means that Ysgramor most likely lost his unnamed wife during the attack, and as he sailed away, the story goes that he watched his burning city with ebony tears seeping from his eyes. Ingal, his eldest and the greatest blacksmith the Atmorans had ever known, took this ebony, heating it with lightning from the sky and cooling it with the ocean's waters. This axe was then given to his father, Ysgramor, a symbol of his rage and grief, and he named it Wuthrad, Storm's Tears, or as I like to call it, the Elf Annihilator 3000. Ysgramor landed in the Atmoran port city of Djelkovic, had a bunch of ships created and went to invent the first written human language to record all that he had learned. When the ships were ready, he gathered his revenge party, the 500 companions, and his most trusted were named as part of the Circle of Ship Captains, which is where the modern companions get the Circle leadership group from. The ships were the Jorvaska, captained by Ysgramor himself, the Harak, led by Ingal, the Runzu, led by Ilgar, the Kalkars, the Krillot Lok, the Fallowfire, the Sadon Wraith, the Ilgamet, and the Kyrion. I've probably butchered most of those. Now, given the number of ships, I'm willing to bet that there were more than just 500 going back to Skyrim for vengeance. In my view, while not having the same title, the companions were like the knights in his ranks, and each would have a squire attending them, something that will come up later. Then there were the sailors, the more common soldiers, and perhaps even dragons joined Ysgramor's ranks. There are theories that Ysgramor himself was a dragon priest, given his affinity for the Thu'um, or perhaps even a dragon called Ys Malathax. the Northerly Dragon, but this isn't an Ysgramor video, so we can leave that one for another day. Before the 500 companions could even land in Skyrim, they were struck by a fierce storm, apparently summoned by their own patron goddess, Kine. The storm claimed the hierarch and Ysgramor's son, Ingol, although, thanks to some sea-splitting nonsense, Ysgramor was able to claim his eldest's body, which made Ilgar his new heir. The storm will come up later, but the important thing to know for context is that Ysgramor was now twice aggrieved, filled with rage and grief. And it seemed that the companions shared in this too. When they arrived back in Skyrim, they went absolutely ballistic on the Snow Elves for the families that had been lost in Sarthal, and the Snow Elves were simply not prepared. They were battered up and down Skyrim, and could find no help elsewhere. You see, the Snow Elves basically didn't have any friends. The Aelids were as far north as Falkreath, but didn't help them. And the Dwemer weren't any help until after the war had effectively been lost, and I wouldn't call what they did particularly helpful. Unable to properly combat Ysgramor's vengeful army, they found themselves forced into a last stand in Solstheim. Just as a note, Solstheim wasn't an island at this point. As I've covered in a few videos, but most recently this Merak vs Alduin one, Solstheim was originally a northern province attached to the mainland, but Merak and Valok's battle exploded it off the mainland, which happened quite a bit after this. Now in the final stand, the Snow Elves were led by the Snow Prince, a great figure for the people to rally behind, being hailed as a saviour. During this battle, called the Battle of Mosring, the Snow Prince fought with great prowess and elegance, slaying one of the companions, a shield maiden named Jofrior. With his ice magic and spear, the Snow Prince carved his way through the Nordic army, as reported by the Nords themselves, only to be faced by Jofrior's daughter and squire, a 12-year-old girl named Finna. Finna took her mother's sword and threw it at the Snow Prince, slaying him. And thus, the final hope of the Snow Elves was ended by a 12-year-old girl. Oof. Don't worry though, things don't really get any better for them.
I know, it's hard to understand, but at least now it can't get much worse.
But it did get worse, shortly after Ole lost his wife.
While the Nords burned the bodies of the rest of the slain Snow Elves, they were so impressed by their prince's performance that they made a barrow for him, Yolgir Barrow, which curiously doesn't appear in Dragonborn but does in Blood Moon, even though they both take place in Solstheim. News quickly spread of the Snow Prince's defeat, and this was when the Snow Elves knew their home was lost to them. Thus they turned to the Dwemer, a race they had great respect for, although I wouldn't call them friendly or even allies. The Dwemer kinda hate everyone, including each other. So when the Snow Elves came seeking refuge, these dwarven dickheads made them eat toxic fungus from Blackreach, which made them blind and forced them into servitude. Now, not all the Snow Elves agreed to this pretty shite arrangement, and instead took their chances on the surface, which either ended in hiding out, like Knight Paladin Gelebor and his chantry, or getting the boot from the Nords. Those that survived tended to do so with the Dwemer, and thus were twisted into the Falmer. Gone were the proud Snow Elves, replaced by the twisted, blind and brutal Falmer, the betrayed, although they would not remain in the service of the Dwemer forever. While they were blind, their other senses improved. They became strong, arguably better adapted to the subterranean reaches they now called home, even compared to their Dwemer overlords, and soon the overlords would be gone. The Falmer managed to gather in force, and waged an underground war against their oppressors, a rebellion known as the War of the Crag. This happened right beneath the feet of the Nords, without them knowing. Well, give or take a few layers of rock. And as it raged on, it proved to be a larger and larger headache for the Dwemer, something I cover in this video. The Dwemer also found themselves at war with the Nords on a couple of occasions, and with the Kaimer, the precursors to the Dunmer, during the War of the First Council. At that war's climax, the Battle of the Red Mountain, the Dwemer would vanish, their halls now empty. And these empty halls would later become home to the Falmer, the new kings of Skyrim's depths. From here, the Falmer would form the perverted culture we see in-game, stealing people from the surface to become their slaves. While it was cut out of the game, likely for fear of it being too dark, this concept art reveals that the Falmer were also known to steal babies from above, which sounds a lot worse when you take into account that they were also known to practice cannibalism. Damn. It's not even the cool kind of cannibalism that the Bosmer do. Now they attack anyone, except seemingly each other, which Gelebor found out when his chantry was attacked by them, leaving only his brother and him as the survivors. Speaking of Gelebor, I have a bone to pick with him, since all he talks about is slaying his brother and Auriel. As the last remaining Snow Elf, he could be the one to tell us more about Snow Elf culture, its hierarchy, why they attacked the Atmorans in Starfall, and even more about their wider pantheon, but he only really talks about Auriel and his chantry. It's a shame considering that he may well be the very last of his kind, noble yet alone. So that leads us to the question posed at the start of the video. Did the Falmer deserve their fate?
Every stone, flower tells a story. Tales of how things were, how they ought to be.
Now I know we're all big elf haters, at least my viewer base seems to be, but even I have to draw a line. No, they did not. I think everything beyond the Snow Prince's death, i.e. the Dwemer nonsense and the purging of the Snow Elf citizens, is a step too far. It's a step too far for anyone, but the real question is whether the Snow Elves deserve the retribution of the 500 companions to be forced into a war. Well, yes, I do think they had this bit coming, purely because there were plenty of innocent civilians in Starfall killed by the Snow Elves, including children. The big question though is why the Night of Tears even happened in the first place. Now I suggested in the earlier segments of this video that there were always going to be rising tensions between the Snow Elves and the Atmorans because of the rate at which the Nordic population was growing. Humans and elves are also damn near hardwired to hate each other, and it doesn't help that the Atmorans very much see themselves as Shor's people, while the Snow Elves were Auriel's people. Conflict was always going to happen, but for an attack like that, there had to be some kind of trigger. The humans believe it came out of nowhere, while the elves believe that it came from some sort of unknown crime committed by Ysgramor and the Atmorans. We don't know the truth. But as with most things, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and due to its placement in the ruins of Starfall, I think the Eye of Magnus' discovery more than likely led to the Night of Tears. When constructing Starfall, the Atmorans discovered the Eye of Magnus and seemed to want to keep it buried. They had access to the Eye throughout the Merithic and First Era, yet nothing majorly catastrophic happened, at least with the Eye anyway. Nor are there reports that people wanted to use the Eye, except from sealing away the evil wizard, Yurik, to keep him from reviving. When it was discovered, however, it seems the Snow Elves coveted the Eye, although for what purpose we do not know. Perhaps they wanted to use the Eye to become supremely powerful, sort of like what we see with Ancano, who went from generic Thalmor fodder to genuinely near godlike in power, which is a monumental power boost. Or perhaps they wanted to prevent the Nords from causing the world to explode, as was nearly the case with Ancano again. That guy's a real prick, am I right? While I do think the Night of Tears is ground to start a war, I do think the intention here matters, since if the Snow Elves saw this as a noble act, a sort of necessary evil, and possible negotiations broke down, then it doesn't seem as bad, but at least it's justifiable. Now if they wanted the Eye of Magnus for self-serving reasons, it's tough to have much remorse. It also depends on what the Eye of Magnus actually is, and what it is capable of. Sure, it made Ancano a near god level mage, and nearly blew up the world, but this was from misuse. The Eye of Magnus could actually be the eye of the god Magnus. Who would have thunk? While we don't know if there is a connection with this myth, the Khajiit have a tale about Magnus, who they call Magrus, losing his eye after getting into a fight with Boethra, Boethia, and Lorcan. Only able to see out of one eye, he crashed into Azura's realm, Moonshadow. Azura then took out his eye, judging him to be a cad and a coward unfit to rule the realm. Another version goes that Magnus intentionally gave Azura his eye as an offering, and this eye became the sun that opens at dawn and closes at dusk, acting as a sort of ethereal mirror. Because Magrus only had one eye when he crash landed on Azura's house, perhaps the other eye is the Eye of Magnus. It is said that Magrus's eye is a stone that can reflect valiance, ethereal magic, and could thus hold the light and maybe even power of Aetherius itself. It's almost like having a mirror of the sun itself, and this Aetherius connection could explain how Ancano became a godlike being, since those with a connection to Aetherius are usually some sort of god. It could also explain why the world almost broke, because it's like bringing a star onto the surface of the earth. If this is the case, then it follows that the Nords didn't really touch the stuff. Valiance is known to be an elven art, and the Nords tended to stick with their magic, called, clever magic. Yeah, I'm not joking about that one. This is what Shaw used to create Sovngarde, although he could have used his brain to come up with a more creative name, and is also what Ysgramor's Clever Man used to summon this guy, a storm atronach bear. Ooh, I want one. Now, we don't know a lot about the Snow Elves and their magic, other than that they liked sun magic and ice spells, but I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that they had some knowledge of Valiance. If they had the means, the Eye of Magnus could have been their portal to becoming something much greater, and there is a reason as to why elves tend to look to become something more. In my mind, elves tend to come in two categories. Either A, they have culturally accepted what they are and work to appease the gods that gave them what they have. This includes the Bosmer with their worship of Y'ffre, the Dunmer with their worship of the three good Daedra, and the Orsimer with their worship of Malakath, and here's the Malakath video if you want more on that guy. Then there's B, the ones who want to go and become immortal. This includes the Dwemer who built the Numidium for that purpose, the Outmer who wants to go back in time to stop them from ever being mortal in the first place, and here's a Falmer video for that one because it is a doozy, and the Aelids who sought immortality through becoming liches. I'm not quite sure what the deal with the Marelmer is, but they have an immortal king, Orgnum, and I'm also not sure if the Snow Elves potentially sit in this spot too, although because of how their culture apparently aligns with the Outmer, and because of the many Aldmeri elements of their culture that we do know about, I'm more inclined to believe that they sit in this category. Knight Paladin Gelebor is still alive to this day though, and we're assuming he was around in the Mirific era, even before the Dragon Wars, so he's several thousand years old at least. The thing is, from my interpretation, elves care less about actually living forever and more about reclaiming their history and the power they feel that once belonged to them. You'll remember before that I mentioned elves being descended from the Aldmer, from a continent called Aldmeris. Well, these Aldmer were descended from the old Elnafe, immortal spirits that once roamed Aetherius. These old Elnafe were sort of godly, but when they came to the world, specifically on Aldmeris, the world itself drained them of their power, which was a side effect of Lorcan's deception when he tricked the Aedra into making the world. While some elves accepted this, at least as a culture, and some go as far as to express gratitude to Lorcan for making the world, some are still angry and seek to return to when they were the old Elnafe, these godly immortal spirits. This remains the goal of the Falmer, and perhaps this is what the Snow Elves wanted to do with the Eye of Magnus. It was their gateway into Aetherius, their way to be connected to it again, and be the old Elnafe. Culturally, what we know about the Snow Elves lines up with the Outmer specifically, as I said before, especially with their gods, but we don't really know a lot about them, and that brings us to another point. History is written by the victors.
In the name of Kain,
in the name of Shor, and in the name of Atmora of old. You are Ysmir now, the dragon of the north.
The Atmorans didn't just win, they dominated. A 12-year-old girl killed the greatest of the Snow Elves. If you're a Song of Ice and Fire fan, it's like if Season 1 Arya killed Daemon Targaryen. If that happens, you might as well just pack it in. It was like the Snow Elves' defeat was written in the stars and mandated by the gods themselves, but what if it was the opposite? In their crusade for vengeance, the Atmorans destroyed a lot of the Snow Elves' record, largely explaining why a lot of their history was lost. This is likely a repayment for what happened to Sarthal 10 times over, led by the wrath of a mourning father. But what if the Atmorans were trying to hide something? What if Ysgramor had committed some sort of crime, as some elven scholars believe, and hid it during the war by destroying all these records? I still personally believe the Eye of Magnus was at the centre of this all, because it wouldn't have been the centre of the College of Winterhold questline if it wasn't. I mean, come on, it's storytelling 101. This plot device is causing the Nords to get into a fight with an elven empire again. It's cyclical storytelling. To quote George Lucas, it's like a poem, it rhymes. It's also worth noting that even the Nords show some remorse for the damage that was done to the Snow Elves. There's the burying of the Snow Prince, and a tale told by sailors of Winterhold, one of the oldest of Skyrim cities. The story is called The Ship of Ice, taking place in the freezing of Atmora, when the last of the ships were setting sail from Ylkavik, the Atmoran port city where Ysgramor led his companions from. While freezing their balls off, sailors found themselves approached by a Snow Elf child, wearing a thin gown, unbothered by the cold. She tells them to look upon this frozen land, the damage dealt by the frostfall, and says that by destroying her homeland with their weapons, the homeland of the Nords was claimed by the cold, and thus lost to them. This was born as a consequence for the actions of their forefathers, and I would not say that this is a tale written by people who were victorious without regret. I think even Nords now show some regret for the actions against the Snow Elves. In my mind, they were right to retaliate after Sarthal, especially if the Eye of Magnus was at its heart, because if there was any attempt of diplomacy, it didn't seem to bear any fruit. The Snow Elves fought. They lost. Their last hope slain by an Atmoran child, the same kind of child they slew in their hundreds, maybe even thousands in Sarthal. There is poetic justice in that, but their near eradication and punishment at the hands of the Dwemer was beyond what any race should suffer. There is also the subject of Kain summoning storms against the 500 companions, and while the Nords look at this as a challenge that they overcame, perhaps Kain knew what her people would wreck and sought to turn them away, only complying with Ysgramor after the accidental death of his son, Ingol. There is also the question of whether the Snow Elves could ever return to being the proud race they once were. Gelebor seems to think that there is hope that the Falmer will once again return to being the Snow Elves, and if there are others like Gelebor out there, perhaps there is a chance. While it was only a story, the Ship of Ice could have had some truth to it. Most stories do. That was the last ship to leave Atmora, and perhaps some Snow Elves found themselves inhabiting the frozen continent, heading further north in the hope of hiding away from the Nords that stole their land, ironically switching places with their foes. Maybe this is where the remaining Snow Elves are staying, and while the Frostfall is seen as what made the continent a cold, dead place, perhaps this cold is what's keeping the Snow Elf race alive. They are forgotten, out of the picture and out of minds, but they are safe, away from the world, surrounded by snow, ice, and a land in which only they can thrive. It is, perhaps, the best kind of mercy they could hope for. The real villain here is the Dwemer though. Those guys are arseholes. What a dick move.
I have a confession to make. I'm blind.
No
Yeah. Although I've trained my other senses to a point where you wouldn't notice my handicap, in the
Thanks for watching this Falmer deep dive. Let me know what you think of my theories, whether that be of the Snow Elves' potential return or what the Eye of Magnus actually is. There's a lot of question marks around the Falmer, and even after all my research, it's tough for me to give you answers that make sense. It's sort of why half my videos end with a don't make any sense, because most of Elder Scrolls lore does not. Still, there's a chance we could see the Snow Elves in the Elder Scrolls 6. A very, very slim chance. We know nothing about that game, so anything goes until we get an actual look at what Bethesda has been cooking. Do you agree with my conclusions about the Falmer? Do you think they deserved what they got? Do you feel sorry for them, or do you think they should have got it worse? Let me know by doing the whole YouTube ritual of liking, commenting and subscribing. Also, this video was brought to you by this poll here, so thank you to everyone who voted on that. And hopefully I will see you in another video later down the line.
When darkness came, you wiped my tears. I remember your hand on mine. Now all I